Good afternoon. My name is Albert Krahler. I'm assistant professor at the University for Continuing Education in Krems, Danube University Krems, and the coordinator of the Miriam project, which hosts this 9th edition of the joint webinar series of altogether 7 Horizon Europe funded projects that focus on irregular migration in one way or another. In this edition of the webinar, the focus will be on the evidence base, the quantitative evidence base on the irregular migrant population and irregular migration movements. We have 3 speakers today. Megan Hendo, a senior researcher at ICMD, Yasmin Slotas from the Migration Policy Institute, Associate Director there, and also a researcher involved in the Miriam project, and finally Norbert Cyrus, Research Associate at EMIS at the University of Osnabrück, and also from one of the partner institutes of the Miriam project. Together, the different presentations will highlight the dynamic interplay of data, policymaking, and public debates. So we are looking not so much on what the data specifically tell us about the composition and the scale of composition of the irregular migrant population and the scale of irregular migration, but rather reflects on what the data can say, what they are used for, and what they are not used for. So it's more a reflection today about the use of data in policymaking. We will also reflect on the quality of the existing evidence base and gaps, and the accessibility of quantitative information. I won't need any more longer and would like to invite you, Megan, to take the floor.
Thanks, Albert, and thanks for the introduction. So I'll wait for the presentation to be shared. Great. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to present some of the our recent publication on how fit is the data on irregular migration. This was developed together with a number of partners in the Miriam project. So in that sense also represents kind of also some overarching or broader kind of conclusions that we've made based on looking at and reflecting on the different research conducted thus far. Here for this presentation, basically as maybe an introduction. So of course, I think for all of us here, we're well familiar with the understanding that irregular migration is notoriously hard to measure for a number of reasons. Nevertheless, we also see that data is still being cited in policymaking in this area where, for example, quote, illegal border crossings are used as a substitute, or outdated maximum estimates are used as a low bar, for example, as was done in some cases with the clandestino estimates by future standards. And we also see new policies are being put forward that aim to fill the gap in information, for example, on overstayers, as we see with some new EU policies. So what we've tried to do here in this publication, and here on this slide, you see a link to also a snapshot of the policy brief that we put out, is to try to give kind of a 360-degree overview of what we currently know on the extent of irregular migration across the EU and also the robustness of that data. What I'll do is kind of go through the different elements of the publication, which first reflects on what kind of data do we have or what is available in terms of estimates of stocks and indicators of flows. Where is potentially new data sources, where are new data sources potentially coming in, particularly for the EU? Where will we continue to have missing data that we need to also be aware of? And here in the slide, I'll have a brief. I have a slide on the new methods being tested under the Miriam project. I won't go into much detail on that. I'm sure also Albert, as coordinator, would be able to speak on that in case there are questions. And then we have, I wanted to also take some time to highlight the key takeaways that we have based on the research done across the project. Yeah, so next slide. This is, I know, quite a busy slide, but what I aim to do here is kind of to highlight the research and the findings done in the MIRAM project related to stocks. Within the MIRAM project, researchers collected available information on recent estimates of the stock of irregular migrants at the national level and also compared these to those produced in 2008 under the Clandestino project. Taking the most recent estimate of at least medium quality, they provided estimates dating from 2016 to 2022. And what's important here is that these estimates were taken primarily from external sources and therefore don't have a harmonized methodology. So each comes with its own set of limitations and also needs to be understood that they can't necessarily be immediately compared. In this sense, we also understand that these estimates and any estimate of irregular migrant population stocks, they vary widely based on, for example, the type of information being used, whether it's census, municipal registers, users of NGO services, for example, in local level estimates sometimes, what kind of methodology has been used to produce that estimate, the scope of the estimate. So here we have national estimates, and also I provided a snapshot of the local level estimates that were also mapped in the project. The level of detail and granularity in each estimate varies, and very importantly, also how they define irregular migrant, because this can differ pretty widely, actually. As an example, so for the Austrian estimate for 2022, they, for example, used a different method than that used in 2008 and included EU citizens. Compared to, for example, in 2008, the focus was on third country nationals. So at first glance, if you look at these values, they might appear to be fairly close, but in fact, they can't really be perfectly compared and would have to be adjusted to be comparable in that sense. So, that also was one of the key points that we also wanted to highlight in terms of understanding of irregular migration estimates that are being used. What we did find across the mapping that was done was no definitive change in the overall number of regular migrant population stock since 2008. At the country level, there were 5 countries that demonstrated no change, 3 demonstrated a potential increase, and 5 a potential decrease, which overall suggests that the irregular migrant population across the 12 European countries that were mapped in the MIRAM project and are listed here, if you can read them, have remained relatively stable since 2008. And I think that's also a really important message that we've seen in the mapping of irregular migrant estimates and looking backwards in terms of how it's changed over time. Next slide. So here is also the information that we've collected and analyzed related to irregular migrant flows, looking at the indicators that are being used. What I want to highlight here is that what we've found in this analysis was a heavy reliance on data related to indicators on entering and leaving the country irregularly. So either border apprehensions or returns, for example. Also data on those losing status through a negative asylum decision, and importantly, also regularization decisions, so provision of status. There's very limited or even no data at all on those who are born into irregularity or those irregular migrants who may pass away. I know this is going to be highlighted in some of the cases and examples that Norbert will speak to, so I won't go into detail. Also, for example, on overstayers, that's something that the work that Norbert will present will also speak to. What we've found is that there's a lot of attention on those on those indicators and trends that are highly visible, but there are also nearly no available estimates of irregular migration flows. So this is something that is a limitation with regard to irregular migrant flows data. On the next slide, just briefly wanted to highlight also some new data sources. I know also Yasmine will speak about interoperability, so I again won't go into super detail, but Here I wanted to highlight what we've seen in terms of the potential new data sources that will be available at the EU level. So there are a number of existing and new databases that are being established or even adjusted or revised. And there's a lot of expectations about what these different databases will be able to provide. The entry-exit system, together with ETIAS, for example, will provide information on third country nationals coming to the EU for short-term stay or visa-free. So either visa-free or Schengen visa holders. So the overstay, the type of overstay the entry-exit system in that sense will identify will be those within that scope. So those who are coming for a short-term stay only, not, for example, those that may overstay national permits. There are a lot of concerns for a wide range of fundamental rights. And this is also related to interoperability and how the data is accessed across these different databases and then used. Also in the revised Eurodac, what is foreseen is also the potential to use beyond asylum. So in that sense, the new data that is foreseen or the expectation here is that this the new data that will be available might allow also for policymakers or others to understand a little bit more about secondary movements. Here, the interoperability element is really key to that expectation and understanding how they will be able to access the data and how people move through different types of status in these different systems. Yeah, I won't go into much detail. I think Yasmine will also cover this as well. So on the next slide, I wanted to spend some time to highlight the missing data that I've mentioned, for example, in the previous slide that, for example, data and entry-exit system will collect on third country nationals coming for short-term stay. But in this sense, the data on overstayers at large for Europe will still be incomplete, let's say. What we know, what we have in looking at also the data that on irregular migration is that the data that we do have can also be very much flawed, partly because of the lack of harmonization of statistics and how they're collected. So whether they're done in a cumulative manner, whether there's, for example, some examples of double counting, as we saw in 2015, examples of double counting of those entering via, for example, Greece, and then again at the Hungarian border. And what this means in terms of our understanding of indicators of irregular flow arrivals. Also potentially regarding return decisions, if, for example, they might be issued to the same person across different EU member states. And there are questions related to are low return rates perhaps related to this. So in terms of that, there's it's not missing data perhaps, but it's also about the lack of harmonization and what that means for the data that we're looking at across the EU. In terms of data that we will continue to miss is, or that we don't really have much on, is on how status may change over time and space. So here, there are some examples of studies looking at this, but it's not necessarily consistent. We have the example of the ENED study, which looked at how migrants lose and gain status from over time. Also, as I mentioned before, secondary movements is something where I think there's a lot of desire to have that information and expectation about where Eurodac revisions might be able to fulfill that gap. And then there is some data that is available through some regularizations or biographic surveys that are done. For example, in Ireland, they have collected in their regularization, recent regularization, information on the entry routes of subsequently regularized migrants. So they can then also see under what conditions they've entered and then in some sense understand a change in status over time. In Spain also, and I think again, Norbert will speak to this, but the Padrón data can also provide information on the average duration of stay that migrants have before regularization, also across different channels. In the next slide, I just have, again, it's a very busy slide, but I just wanted to flag the new methods that are being tested in the MIRM project. to develop estimates of irregular migration using either new methods or new sources. I won't go into this for time reasons. I think either if the slides are shared after the webinar, then I have some links here. Otherwise, I think all the information is also available on the MIRAM website. But there are a few really interesting methods being tested and pilots on developing these estimates. And what I think is important is also that even with these new methods, there are really important limitations and issues that emerge across these different, the engagement of these different methods. So there's not a gold standard per se, but there's some interesting new possibilities that we're exploring. And then on the last slide, I just wanted to highlight our key takeaways. So firstly, that indicators and estimates of irregular migration have really important limitations and uncertainties. This for us is really key in terms of how we communicate irregular migration, on the data that we're using, on how it may be used by policymakers. And also will continue to be an important issue even with new sources of data, new methods that are being tested. What we've found in our mapping of estimates of irregular migration is also that the scale has not greatly increased at the country and at the EU level since 2008. So I think this is also a really important point to highlight as well. Thirdly, we see a lot of expectations on what the pact and the relevant policies that will be implemented under the pact will deliver. And I think we have to also manage those expectations and understand what this new data will not necessarily be able to say, and adjust what we're saying it does say, you know, to be clear about the scope of our conclusions. In that sense, we will still have blind spots. And so one of the key ways to address these blind spots is also more efforts on regular estimation and to harmonize indicators in order to reduce the potential double counting. And lastly, something I think that we want to highlight is that and I think we'll see in the next presentations on how data is used in public discourse as well, is that we find that irresponsible handling of data can undermine informed decision making and even democratic discourse. So it's important in this sense to really communicate the limitations, the uncertainties, and yeah, manage expectations of what we can say with this data. And that's then I hand back over, I think, to you, Albert, or to Yasmine for the next presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Megan, for this overview of what kind of data we have and what where the gaps are and what the expectations are in view of new developments. Yeah, I would just like to respond to one question from the chat. There is actually a YouTube channel where we will post the video of this webinar. So please check it out. I think yeah, my colleague Jill Ahrens has just shared the link to where you can also find the recordings of previous editions of this webinar series. Thanks a lot. Yasmine, you have the floor. And take up a thread from Megan.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think Megan did a wonderful job already introducing the many issues that we see with data and some of the very rich work that the MIRAM project has been working on. I would like to now take the conversation a little step further, and Megan already alluded to that. What then we do with this data that has quite some issues? There are some gaps. We have to manage our expectations. I will go through some of the challenges still that we see, but also try to point towards some lessons that we can learn that could potentially help improve how we use the data currently. So we can go to the next slide. Without going into this too deeply, because I know Norbert will dive more into the role of data in the overall discourse. But I want to make clear is that data can sound very boring and a bit technical. And what do we mean with data? All these different estimates, there's all these different statistical techniques. But I think here all these headlines show that they play a major role in shaping the public debate. Sometimes there's overestimations, underestimations. Sometimes they're used as a counter argument. But beyond the public discourse, they're very important in policymaking, whether it is to identify the needs of irregular migrants, so knowing maybe they have medical needs or other types of support, understanding what the big policy priorities are, but also assessing whether policies are effective, yes or no. So tracking the effectiveness, policy evaluation. So there's countless ways in which we use data. And even though it sounds a bit technical or boring at a time, they make real differences on the ground. And therefore, it's important that we understand the challenges that are there and try to improve the data that is there and learn how to work best with maybe the limited data that is out there if we are not able to improve it. So moving to the next slide. Yes, I will dive a little bit into the challenges of effective data practices. And here you see a picture of a workshop we organized in Europe. Beyond that, or in Brussels, we also build on the excellent work of many of our MIRAM partners that have conducted case study research in 10 EU countries and also in Canada. So we really built on all that rich information and rich examples to see on the ground where are really the challenges and where are opportunities for improvement. Going to the next slide. I want to quickly walk you through some of the challenges that we found. I think clearly there are gaps in data collection. There's a strong focus on irregular border crossings, but we know much less about the needs or characteristics of irregular migrant populations. I think Megan already mentioned a lot on this topic, so I'll skip over it a bit quickly. But also there's a lot of unclear and inconsistent definitions. For example, sometimes asylum applicants are included in the estimates of irregular migrant population. Sometimes they are not. We also see inconsistencies across EU member states in their definitions. And it makes it very tricky because also at the European Commission compiles the data from the different member states to try to track trends overall in the EU. But if every member state uses a different definition, this is of course not comparable. And then we also see a lot of issues in terms of data literacy. So the people that use the data or have to interpret the data in their daily work, and it could be a policymaker, but it could also be someone working for an NGO or a journalist or someone working in advocacy. They see numbers, but the entire background story is often not presented together with the data. So it's very unclear. Sometimes estimates are being interpreted as actual facts. Or we know exactly this many people crossed the border. Well, actually, it's an estimate, and we're not entirely sure what the exact number is. And also, they're not always aware of, there's often a use of confidence intervals. What does this mean? How do I interpret that in the work? So there's a lot of room for improvement in this area. So improving the data literacy. So this is the ability of different people to understand the data that they get in front of them and that they're using every day. Maybe important also to understand a little bit why these issues arise is because a lot of data collection in the field of irregular migration is a byproduct of operational activities on the ground. The number one objective is not always to collect data. It's just a byproduct. It gets collected along the way. And this results in data that may not align with the needs of the data users. So there's a disconnect between those who collect the data and then the needs of those who use the data. So this creates a lot of the issues. I'll go a little bit more deeply in the next slide into the obstacles of data access and sharing. And then there's also data non-usage and underusage. So even if there is data and it is of high quality and you're able to access it, which is in many cases not possible, even then data is often not used due to a variety of reasons. Sometimes people are not aware that data exists. So it's a bit hidden, it's a bit difficult to access, or there's a bit of distrust about the reliability of the data, or it's just unclear how reliable the data is, and then people rather not use the data at all. And then, of course, we also see what I call misuse, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional, so maybe misinterpretation of existing data. And this could be a political party that that has a certain claim and therefore inflate or deflate the numbers that are out there. But it could also be an organization that tries to increase their funding, and their funding depends on the number of people that they serve, and it benefits them if they overemphasize or overinflate the community that they're serving. So there's all these different intentions and dynamics going on when people use the data in the end, and this can result in either not using the data or using it or misinterpreting or misusing it. We can go to the next slide. So here, I just wanted to dive a little bit more deeply into one of the barriers. You can look into the paper, you get more background information on all the different challenges that I mentioned, but just to kind of untangle how complex all these are. So just to access or share data on irregular migration, there's multiple barriers. One is a legal barrier. Luckily, we have the GDPR in Europe. It's for data protection. And it's very important that it is there. It's not an obstacle in and of itself, but there's a bit of misinformation or a bit of a fear to overstep on the GDPR. And then there's different organizations that don't share data just out of fear that they may overstep. So it's very important that there's a more clear understanding what are the rules and what is within the rules and what is possible. So that I think is a very important next step. Then there's just technical obstacles. Megan was already mentioning interoperability. There's a lot of different databases that exist. If you could connect them, that could bring a lot of benefit. But yeah, sometimes this is technically not possible or very challenging or costly to arrange. And there's also often a lack of resources and staff to invest in making sure that this can be created. And then lastly, I think this is quite interesting. What we found from the research is that a lot of the data sharing happens in informal settings. So like it's institutional relationships and relationships of trust between individuals that know and how to find each other and then share data with each other. And if you're not well connected or there's no trusted relationships, certain people or certain stakeholders are cut off of access to the data, and it cannot inform their work and it cannot inform their a proper dialogue on these very important issues. So here again, we see these different issues. If we go to the next slide, I've been talking a lot about these challenges, but what I hope to make clear and how to visualize it is that there's pretty much a data pathway all the way from the beginning. Is there data at all? How do we define that data? Can we access or share that data? And then how do we use it? All along the way, there's all these different challenges that arise, and challenges that arise early on can trickle down to the end. And there's different stakeholders involved at different steps along the way. So if there is a data gap early on, as a data end user, you cannot fix that anymore. If the measurement is unclear or there's not clear information about what definition was used, that is a problem later on for the end user. So this is just to show that it's very important to be aware of all the different things and obstacles happening earlier on and all along the data pathway up until the moment where the final user, whether it's a policymaker or somewhere an NGO, will start using this data. Moving to the next slide. But luckily, there's also some recommendations that we can build on to make sure that this data can be used and to empower stakeholders to have more informed policies and more informed practices and better serve irregular migrant communities. You can go to the next slide. So one that Megan already mentioned is the harmonization of definitions and measurement methodologies. So we have seen efforts already in this area also at the European Commission, so they're very welcomed. Then we also think it's very important to invest in capacity building, so to make sure that those who work with this data have sufficient understanding to know what the problems are. So it's not, they don't need to be full statistical experts, but they need to understand all the potential problems. Is something an estimate or is it a real fact, etc. And then we can also strengthen local efforts. There are some really interesting examples, for example, in Utrecht in the Netherlands, where irregular migrants receive specific cards to access healthcare, but also in Spain, where people, irrespective of their migration status, so also those with irregular status, sign up to the Padron system, and through that can access a range of local resources, public and municipal resources. And because of this, both in Utrecht and in Spain, in many municipalities, there's a very clear overview of the irregular migrant population and their medical or specific needs, which helps these public services do better, serve these communities. So this is, and at the same time, you have the data. So this is, I think, a very promising way, because also here we see the most pressing gap in data. So we hear a lot about flows, but really the specific needs, how can we support irregular migrants on the ground? That was time and again where we heard that the most issues were taking place. And then lastly, it's a bit of a mixed message, because yes, improving interoperability could really improve access to data and give a more full picture. It also allows for sharing data in real time if all the systems are connected. Now, often there's a delay in how data gets transferred across different stakeholders, reinterpreted, repackaged, and then it goes into a report, and then someone else can use it. So that can be useful, but at the same time, there's also a lot of risks in terms of the rights of the basic rights of whose data is collected. So here it's very important to continue to protect data privacy. And yeah, Megan already mentioned, I decided to cut out that example due to time, but there's more information in our policy brief, and I'll share the link in the chat on the efforts on the EU side on the interoperability framework. And there's indeed promises and potential benefits, but also a lot of risks. And it's very important to weigh those against each other and see if that fulfills, if that's worth it. I think we can move to the final slide, if I'm correct. Yeah, so I'm happy to stay in touch here via the QR code. You can also access the policy brief. And I say, visit the irregularmigration.eu website of the Mirum project, where you find lots of other great papers and resources on this topic. And I think overall, as the Mirum project, also the taxonomy of migrant irregular status, all contribute to a better understanding of all the different issues that are there. And once we have this better understanding, even though we cannot reach perfect data, as Megan mentioned, at least we are better informed about the limitations of the data that is out there, and then how to best use it in the best possible way. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Yasmin, for also almost a 360-degree view of policy issues and around the use of data and how to improve the database, the evidence base, and its use in policymaking. I think two important observations here is there are strong benefits of data sharing and also risks associated with it. I think you highlighted the need to respect privacy, and what I would maybe add in addition to that is the need to consider here both the national level and the EU level, and consider also ways how you can increase data sharing for the benefit of analysis without actually sharing personal information on individuals that are captured by different data sets or databases. Because that's actually one of the key reasons of concerns, especially on the civil society side, for example, but also partly on the enforcement side in national context, on making data accessible to expert community researchers, for example, and various ways to deal with that. So I think that's one aspect that I just wanted to highlight, and the second that I actually also already implied is to look at the different scales that we are looking at. So there's, as many mentioned, the local level, and also different needs that occur there as opposed to the national or the EU level. So it's we have to have sort of an idea of a nested architecture that allows also for flexibility and consideration of specific needs arising at specific policy levels. I don't want to take much more time, but before I invite Norbert to make his contribution on the use of data, in particular policy debates in different country cases, I also would like to invite the audience to think of questions that you want to ask already now, and you can start posting them in the chat and for the Q&A session that we will still have quite some time afterwards for Q&A. So think of your questions now. Thanks. So Norbert, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Hello together. Megan and Yasmin have so far talked about the availability of irregular migration data and the necessity or the chances to improve. So I will turn to another aspect and consider the presence and the use of irregular migration data in particular policy fields. My presentation is a preview of a forthcoming MIRAM working paper on a comparative multiple case study of 5 particular policy fields which we have investigated in 5 national contexts. The starting point of our thank you, Albert. The starting point of our investigation was let's say overall observation that the irregular migration politics based on a very poor evidence basis. So existing data is not really used, and there are no real references made to existing irregular migration data. Usually political decisions based more on ad hoc decisions in response to particular events or incidents that need to be coped with in a political sense. So in the discussion of this particular situation, there are two explanations for the situation. The one points to a lack of quality indicators and estimates, the lack of data and knowledge. The other is a deliberate ignorance of inexpedient data. So simply that data is not used because it is not expedient for those who could or should use the data. For both questions, there's in the meanwhile some literature that discusses intensively these hypotheses, and in the working paper we give an account of these debates. But our leading question then was which flow data is available in the 5 selected policy fields, and what factors influences the presence of data on irregular migration flows in public debates and policy decision making. Next slide. So we have 5 case studies designed each on a specific topic in a national context. The first deals with visa overstaying and the irregular migration nexus in the national context of Spain. The study was compiled and by Laura Cassain and Claudia Finotelli. The second deals with border crossing irregular migration nexus. Here is the national context Greece, and the author is Marina Nikolova. The third is protection seeking irregular migration nexus with a national context of Germany, and here I am the author. The fourth is live event irregular migration nexus in the national context of the Netherlands with Lalaine Siruno and Ian Lerkes as author. And finally, temporary residence irregular migration nexus in the, the Canadian context written by Shiva Mohan and Daniela Gio. And these single case studies focus each on a particular topic in a national context with a focus that turned out on administrative data. So this is data that is produced by authorities, by administration, and used particular for their own purposes, but it can also be used for re-evaluation, for reinterpretation of for scientific purposes. We try to do that and worked with analytical and conceptual tools. We have the data presence, data use, the availability, the accessibility, the quality, and the expediency of data. So these are our analytical tools we are applying for an assessment of the case studies. Next slide. So with regard to data presents, we defined that data is present when it is a principal reference point for public debates or policy decision making, and it is explicitly or implicitly relevant whenever an issue is considered, regardless of validity, reliability, and realness. So we can all consider what kind of data is present whenever we talk, for instance, about irregular migration, and this is slightly changing, but in Germany, for instance, it was long border crossing data, but now it turned to the events related to the knife attacks of perpetrators with an immigrant background. So these kinds of presents is something that influences the debates. Then we have the availability of data. This refers to any numerical or statistical information that is supplied by a source as original or echoed data, and thus at hand for actors engaged in public debates and policy decision making. And here again, regardless of the reliability of sources, ranging from fake news, guesstimates, administrative data, and original research data, that is what Yasmin also mentioned. The accessibility of data is important for an assessment of the quality, and means that data is publicly available and electronically accessible with no permissions required. Then next slide. The quality of data refers to the argument as we had heard in the beginning, that available and accessible data is not used due to concerns regarding the quality of data, which is the one explanation. And in the Miriam context, the data quality is assessed by 3 criteria of validity, reliability, and methodological soundness. Then we come to the data use, which really means a concrete invocation of and the reference to data by particular actors engaged in public debates or policy decision making. This is a reference point, and we checked also to what extent data use depends on expediency for the users, what means that the use or the non-use and the invocation or the non-invocation of available data in public debates and policy decision making is guided by data users' given preferences and convictions. Next slide. As I said, we have 5 case studies, very, very brief and nearly distorted. The first case study I mentioned is a temporary residence irregular migration nexus addressed in the Canadian context. Here, the issue of temporary residence addresses mainly the temporarily admitted migrants who have asked timely for renewal of the residence permit but get into an irregular-like situation because authorities fail to make a decision in due time. So they have asked for renewal, but due to the bureaucratic procedures, they fall into a situation that is like an irregular situation, so they can, for instance, not sign any contracts, they cannot rent a flat, and so on. So these kinds of effects are related to this. What we can see in the case that, of course, it is an academic, it is an administrative procedure, so there is data, but it is not public and it's not made available. The quality of the data seems to comply with administrative standard, but in the public, these data or these issues as such is not mentioned, is not addressed, and the issue seems to be for the whole Canadian situation inexpedient, because Canada has a self perception of being a country of immigration and well organized country. When it comes to the live event irregular migration nexus, the particular case is situated in the Netherlands, which has a good administrative structure. And here we looked at the civic data informing on birth, death, and other biographical life events that may be related to a status change into or out of a irregular status. And this data is partly available, in particular when it comes to birth and death data, but it is not easily available. It is registered at local level, and there is some effort necessary to collect and analyze the data, which was beyond the scope of our research effort. And the research team in the Netherlands focused on one particular situation where migrants without a status can achieve a resident status when they can prove that they are parent and can care or have to care for children born in the Netherlands to a person with a Dutch citizenship or resident status. So here aggregate data is available, but again it is not used, it's not present in the Dutch public and does not influence decision making. The border crossing irregular migration nexus in Greece relates to the data on border crossing. It is collected by several authorities and organizations. It is addressing entry and exit and also fatalities. Administrative data is available but not accessible, in particular when it is collected by security authorities, and the quality conforms to administrative standards, but different stakeholders use the available data selectively according to their own expediency. Next slide. The protection-seeking irregular migration nexus in Germany. Here we can see that several authorities produce detailed data related to the processing of protection seeking, which is, as a generalized term, still called asylum procedures. The available data of border security is available but not accessible, and the data produced by other authorities is available and in aggregated form accessible also for research purposes. This relates in particular to the so-called foreigners central register. The stakeholders use data selectively according to expediency and the potential of administrative data for analytical. But there is a potential, that is what I want to say. The potential of administrative data for analytical purposes is there, and it was recently demonstrated in the status trajectories of tolerated third country nationals by Laura Peitz from BAMF. So as Megan said, also there's a lack of data on status change. Here we can see that the data available was used for an analysis that revealed some interesting patterns how status change. And the last single case study relates to the visa overstaying irregular migration nexus in Spain. The researchers have combined the available statistics on visa and regularization, the so-called Irregular register, and the data sets are both are fully available and accessible, and the data quality conforms with administrative standards, and the data is present in the debates but not used. More attention than visa overstaying receives irregular border crossing, and the case study demonstrate by conducting own research and interpretation and assessment and production of estimates that available and accessible administrative data is fit for analytical purposes, in particular in order to analyze patterns of visa overstaying. So this is a particular interesting analysis provided by Claudia and Laura. So last slide. When to sum up, and I fear it is quite it is, I don't know. I mean, it's a bit complicated, all these 5 cases within a short time. But what I would like to emphasize is that the exploratory single cases need to be further tested and replicated in different national contexts required, so that we can really have a good comparison for each of the issues at stake. We had only the chance to examine one issue in one national context. So there is some need and good interest to replicate this study. When we look at the availability, we can say that administrative data is available in all cases, but not really used in all topical fields. The accessibility is uneven. We have encountered data sources which is accessible, in particular which is not accessible. So in particular, border crossing data collected by security authorities and data on the renewal of temporary residence in the Canadian context. Then we have data sources accessible for research purposes, which is mainly data from civil authorities and the asylum processing in Germany and in Netherlands. And then we have fully accessible data sources, the visa statistics and the Irregular register in the Spanish example. The data use depends on the relevance and public attention of an issue independent from availability. That is observation shared across all the cases. We can see that, for instance, in Spain, the colleagues explained that the attention is more on irregular border crossings than on the visa overstaying, although the data is there. So the data expediency matters, and we can observe a selective use of data according to preferences and convictions, regardless of the quality and the validity. And data presents which means the presence that can be easily related to data correlates with public attention to an issue and is selective. And the concrete data presents seems to depend on the influence of agenda-setting agents, which is, I think, an important aspect, complementing to what Yasmin said, that even when data is there and even if people are aware of the data, the use of data is influenced by a particular agendas which are currently prevalent. So, and the last point, and here I would say that the toxic polarization of the debates is important, and just to qualify it, Stephen Mao recently published a book on trigger points where he argued that this polarization in Germany, a book on polarization and the debate on migration in Germany, that the polarization does not address the society as such, but the debates on migration, which is highly polarized, while the overall perception of migration is more modest. So this is, I think, an important uh, uh, information too. And my last point I would like to highlight is that we can see that administrative data is available and can at least partly be utilized for analytical purposes in order to improve the evidence base of public debates and decision making. If that is really used and applied, then depends on other things like the agenda setting and the of the in the debate, and also just because Yasmin said this kind of administrative data is also available at local level and in small scale environments. So it could be a good idea to not to look at the whole picture, to say, okay, we need general data for irregular migration, but to initiate rather also small local projects that do not need too much efforts in order to be implemented. So this could be an important aspect to improve the debates on irregular migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norbert, for these for your presentation of the different case studies. Actually, there are already quite a few questions on the case studies. One was to some extent, I think you already answered that, but maybe you can explain a little bit more on the choice of case studies. You already mentioned that we only have one case per or one country per thematic case or type of flow, and that's something to be expanded. But what was the selection criterion? And the second question here was also on the how you define expediency, what you concretely mean with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, regarding the choice of the countries, I have to say that the application simply said that we should conduct case studies, and the initial idea was to analyze the data with respect to the informative value on particular migration patterns, irregular migration patterns. So we had irregular border crossing, we had status change related to birth, to life events, we had protection seeking as an issue, overstaying and the temporary residence. So these were or labor. These were the issues we were asked to deal with, but due to very limited resources, we had to make to design the studies in a way that we can cope with our limited resources. So we decided to conduct single case studies only in only for one in one location, and then we made the decision according to the again, the expediency for us as researchers. That means that we said in the German context, for instance, the protection-seeking issue is the most prevalent issue. Germany is a country with the largest number of protection seekers processed, so that was a idea. And temporary residence is an issue that was valent in Canada, so we decided to place a particular case study in the Netherlands, in Canada, and so these kind of considerations were guiding us. And expediency simply means in this case that to relate to particular data is expedient. That means it is it relates, it supports already existing convictions and political stances. So when you are in and I mean Yasmin already said that that, for instance, when you are a service provider and you are asking for funding, it is reasonable for such a service provider to say that numbers are probably high. And on the other hand, if you like to call for stricter border controls, you also have to present the numbers of the irregular border crossings. And if you're a humanitarian organization, you rather use the data or the number of fatalities of people drowning, and so these kind of considerations that suit the own agenda. That is what we mean by data expediency.
Thanks a lot, Norbert. There was also a question on overstaying, actually addressing both Norbert and Megan, but I think Megan first on what we actually know about the scale of border of overstay.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just looking at, because one of the challenges, so maybe starting from the first point, one of the key issues related to overstaying is that there continues to be a lack of data. So that data point continues to be missing, right? So in terms of how whether we know the extent, that would anyway be based on whatever methodology is used within each estimate. And as I was not the partner that was conducting the analysis of each of the estimates, I'm not so familiar with whether each one would have or which ones would be able to say the extent. I don't know if Albert, not to put you on the spot, if you would have something to add here, actually, because I looked at also our key findings related to the overall database on the estimates, and I also haven't seen a general conclusion related to this, and I don't think we make one, because the estimates differ according to methodology and according to scope and according to their definition of a regular migrant, as I said in the presentation. So I think, I don't know, from my side, I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. I know from Clandestino that was indeed the case. And I also know that this is the argumentation behind a lot of the policy documents, but there isn't really a concrete evidence base for that argumentation. A lot of the arguments under the entry-exit system were using the Clandestino finding from 2008 and suggesting under that that was related to short-term stay. Although I know from Clandestino estimates that was not the case. It was a general conclusion about overstay and not about the mode of entry, whether visa or residence permit. I don't know if Albert, if you have anything to add.
No, just to say that there are practically no estimates around in the European context. Definitely, maybe Yasmin is aware on top of her head for something on the US. But there are a few surveys that ask about people's previous status, like Megan mentioned the French trajectoire origin survey, which has information on respondents' previous legal status, but they usually don't ask specifically about the mode of entry. So it's impossible. It's possible to say whether people were irregular at point of entry to the country, but whether respondents would understand this as that they overstayed their visa, short-term visa, or arrived completely without a residence permit, that's a different question. So it's not possible to really nail that down. In the past, the European Commission circulated some, I would say, guesstimates, basically claiming that 50% of all irregular migrants entered legally and overstayed. But we don't know the basis of this statement. And it could well be that it's just one of these cases where circular references that go back to a statement in the media in the end, are the basis for such claims that linger on for years and sometimes even decades in the policy debate.
I just wanted to add the one point that I know that this, and I mentioned that this was indeed collected in the Irish case. So I think where you would have information on overstay and overstay of what type of permission, that would very much depend on the national case and whether they collect information on this. I see in the chat the Chilean example, which looks super interesting. Thanks for sharing.
And maybe just to further additions, one is that in the MIRM project, we actually also look at different ways, innovative ways to estimate the scale of overstaying in the Schengen zone. And there is a blog blog post on the UI website that is already out there, and maybe some of my colleagues can post the link to it. Megan showed a screenshot from it written by Luca Manasconi and Dore Recchi, who use basically flight passenger data to arrive at some idea about the scale of overstaying. There is a number that comes out of a process, so to say, but it's not an estimate in the sense of saying, okay, that's the likely number of overstays, but it's rather a possible maximum number of passengers in that particular case that are not accounted for. And I think that again shows the issue of uncertainty that is especially also relevant in the case of flows, which is even more fluffy than trying to get at the number of residents in a certain time span and geography. There was a second, another question related to Norbert, just a quick knowledge question on whether the issue in relation to overstaying in Spain is discussed, or whether the data covers both residence permits overstaying as well as visa overstaying.
Shortly to Julibeth, who wrote from Chile, And I found it quite interesting that you said that you derive estimates from administrative data, and I believe it is really important to use the possibilities, even if it is sometimes intricate to produce estimates. But we should not easily forget these possibilities to work with. So thank you for this indication. Regarding the question of the relation of residence permit and visa permit, what the Spanish colleagues did, they focused on particular nationalities in their analysis who are subject to visa duty, who have to apply for a visa before entering Spain. So residence permit depends on the previous issuing of a visa. Perhaps this may clarify the relation, and the question regarding posed by Laura. On the one hand, the visa data is collected and published at by the European Commission, so it's generally open. And the other Araijo register is also from the beginning on transparent and accessible. So the design was from the outset a very transparent one. And I don't know why this took place, but perhaps it could be an interesting question to ask our colleagues.
Yeah, thank you very much, Norbert. We've already reached the end of your webinar. Maybe Jasmine or Megan, you have something to add to the debate or questions? For me, the only thing to add is that we will actually send out an email to all those registered for this webinar once the recording is online, and so you can have a look at it in case you missed parts of it or want to revisit it. And we are also happy to answer any questions that arise via email and that we haven't been able to respond to in this session. Yeah, and also watch out for the next webinars. There will be webinars probably in April and May, but we will announce on our website and also the website of our sister projects. And hopefully by the time the video recording is available, we can also announce it via the email. Okay, thanks a lot for your participation and for the speakers for their wonderful presentations and insights. All the best and have a nice afternoon.